In the harsh winter of 1315, when famine gripped England like a merciless fist, a woman named Eleanor stood at the door of what had been her home for 23 years and watched as her husband's nephew carried out the last of her possessions, a rough woolen blanket and a single cooking pot, and threw them into the muddy road. Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, I invite you to settle into comfort as we journey back through the mists of time to a world where a woman's security could vanish in a single heartbeat. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift to medieval England, to a time when the law itself could be a woman's greatest enemy. This is a story of loss and resilience, of the cruelty of inheritance customs and the extraordinary strength it took simply to survive. Let the story wash over you gently, and may it carry you peacefully toward rest. Eleanor of Ashford was 41 years old in that winter of 1315, though the lines around her eyes and the silver threading through her brown hair might have suggested she was older. She had been born Eleanor Carpenter in 1274, the daughter of a village carpenter who had held a half-virgate of land, about 15 acres, as a tenant of the local manor lord. It was not wealth, but it was security of a kind, a place in the village hierarchy that meant her family had enough to eat most years and a roof that did not leak too badly when it rained. Eleanor had been 18 when she married William of Ashford, a man 12 years her senior who held a full virgate of land, 30 acres, and practiced the trade of a blacksmith. It had been considered a good match for a carpenter's daughter. William was not handsome, his face marked by old burns from his forge and his hands permanently blackened by soot and metal. But he was steady and hardworking, known throughout the village as an honest craftsman who could shoe a horse, mend a plow blade, or forge a knife with equal skill. He had been widowed 2 years earlier, his first wife having died of a fever, and he needed someone to manage his household, tend his small garden plot, and help with the endless work that filled every peasant's life from dawn to dusk. The marriage had been arranged by Eleanor's father and William, with Eleanor herself having little say in the matter. But this was normal, expected, the way things had always been done. She had not loved William on their wedding day. She barely knew him, had spoken to him perhaps 3 times in her entire life before her father told her she would be his wife. But medieval peasant marriages were practical arrangements, partnerships for survival rather than romantic unions. Love, if it came at all, grew slowly over years of shared work and shared hardship. And love had come, in its way, not the passionate, consuming love of ballads and romances that traveling minstrels sometimes sang about in the manor hall, but something quieter and more durable. William had been kind to her, patient with her nervousness in those early days, appreciative of her competence as she learned to manage his household. He did not beat her, did not waste their resources on ale, did not gamble or whore or engage in any of the vices that made other women's lives miserable. He worked hard at his forge and in the fields, and he treated Eleanor with a gruff respect that gradually deepened into genuine affection. They had tried for children, and Eleanor had conceived 4 times in the first 8 years of their marriage. The first pregnancy had ended in a miscarriage at 4 months. The second had produced a daughter, Mary, who had lived for 2 years before dying of a fever during a particularly harsh winter. The third had been another miscarriage. The fourth had given them a son, John, who had lived for only 3 days, his tiny body never quite managing to master the art of breathing. After that, there had been no more pregnancies, and Eleanor had accepted that God or fate had decided she would not be a mother in this life. The loss of her children had been the deepest grief Eleanor had ever known, a pain that lived in her chest like a physical weight for years. She had watched other women in the village nurse their bobbies, had seen children grow from infants to toddlers to gangly adolescents, and each milestone had been a reminder of what she would never have. But she and William had found ways to continue, to build a life that had meaning even without children. They had worked side by side, he at his forge and she at her endless round of household tasks, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, caring for their chickens and their single milk cow, spinning wool, brewing ale, preserving food for winter. Eleanor had learned blacksmithing, too, in an informal way. William had no apprentice and no son to pass his trade to, so Eleanor had begun helping him when he needed an extra pair of hands. She learned to work the bellows, to hold metal steady on the anvil while he hammered, to recognize when iron was the right temperature for shaping. She learned the smell of hot metal and coal smoke, the rhythm of the hammer's strikes, the satisfaction of seeing a rough piece of iron transformed into something useful. She would never be a blacksmith herself. The guilds did not permit women to practice most trades, and village custom was even more restrictive. But she knew enough to assist competently, and William had relied on her help more and more as he aged, and his strength began to wane. They had been married for 23 years when William died. It had happened suddenly, without warning, on an ordinary day in October of 1315. William had been working at his forge, heating iron for a new plowshare that Thomas Miller had commissioned. Eleanor had been in the cottage, preparing their midday meal, a pottage of peas and barley with a bit of salted pork, the kind of plain, filling food that made up most peasant meals. She heard a loud crash from the forge, the sound of metal hitting stone, and then nothing. She had run out to find William collapsed on the floor of the forge, his face gray, his breathing shallow and labored. She knelt beside him, calling his name, shaking his shoulder, but he did not respond. She ran for help, screaming for neighbors, and within minutes several men had arrived. They carried William into the cottage and laid him on the bed, but there was nothing anyone could do. He died within the hour, never regaining consciousness, never speaking a final word to his wife of more than 2 decades. The physician who sometimes traveled through the area would later tell Eleanor that William's heart had likely failed, a sudden stopping of the vital organ that gave no warning and permitted no treatment. But on that October day, Eleanor knew only that her husband was dead, that the man who had been the center of her life for 23 years was suddenly, impossibly gone, and that she was alone in a way she had never been before. The grief was overwhelming at first. Eleanor went through the motions of preparing William's body for burial, washing him and dressing him in his best tunic, laying him out in the cottage for the required viewing. She stood beside his grave as Father Thomas, the village priest, an elderly man who had christened Eleanor herself 41 years earlier, spoke the Latin prayers for the dead. She accepted the awkward condolences of neighbors and threw the customary handful of earth onto William's shroud as it was lowered into the ground. And then she went home to the empty cottage and tried to understand what would happen next. In those first days after William's death, Eleanor was still numb with shock and grief. She moved through her daily tasks automatically, feeding the chickens, milking the cow, tending the fire. Neighbors brought food, as was customary, and women from the village came to sit with her in the evenings, offering company and comfort. Everyone assured her that she would be taken care of, that the village would not let William's widow starve, that she should not worry. But Eleanor was beginning to understand that she should worry, very much indeed. The problem was inheritance law, or more precisely, the patchwork of customs and legal principles that governed what happened to a peasant's land and goods when he died. In medieval England, these matters were horrifyingly complex and varied from manor to manor, from region to region. But certain principles were common, and almost all of them worked against women like Eleanor. William had held his 30 acres as a customary tenant, a villain in the legal terminology of the time. He did not own the land in the modern sense. The land belonged to the lord of the manor, and William had held it in exchange for rents and services. When William died, his tenancy did not automatically pass to Eleanor. Instead, it would pass to William's heir, according to the custom of the manor. And William's heir, according to the custom practiced on this particular manor, was his nearest male relative. That was his nephew, Geoffrey, the son of William's older brother who had died 10 years earlier. Geoffrey was 28 years old, married with 3 children, and he farmed his own virgate of land on the other side of the village. He was not poor, but he was always hungry for more land, more resources, more security. And now, through the accident of William's death and the operation of inheritance law, he was entitled to claim William's holding. Geoffrey had come to Eleanor 3 days after the funeral. He had been stiffly formal, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, but determined to establish his rights immediately. "Eleanor," he had said, standing just inside the doorway of the cottage as if afraid to come too far inside, "you know that Uncle William's land must pass to me now. That is the custom. I am his heir." Eleanor had felt her stomach clench with anxiety, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, Geoffrey. I understand the custom, but surely there is some provision for me. William and I worked this land together for 23 years. This is my home." Geoffrey had shifted uncomfortably. "There is the widow's portion," he admitted. "You are entitled to 1/3 of the movable goods, the tools, the livestock, the household items. And you may remain in the cottage for 40 days while you make other arrangements." 40 days. Eleanor's voice had risen despite her efforts to stay calm. Jeffrey, it is October. Winter is coming. Where am I supposed to go in 40 days? That is not my concern, Jeffrey said, his voice hardening. I have my own family to support, Eleanor. I cannot afford to maintain you as well. You will have your widow's portion, which is more than generous. You can perhaps find work as a servant, or one of your relatives may take you in. But the land is mine now, and I will be moving my family here before the month is out. Eleanor had tried to argue, had pleaded with him to show mercy, to allow her to stay at least through the winter. But Jeffrey had been unmovable. The law was on his side, and he intended to claim every acre and every advantage that the law allowed. He was not cruel exactly. He was simply doing what any practical man would do, securing his family's future and increasing his own holdings. That his gain came at the cost of his uncle's widow's security was unfortunate, but it was the way of the world. Women without husbands, without sons, without male protectors were vulnerable, and that vulnerability was simply a fact of medieval life that no one questioned. The next weeks had been a nightmare of helpless watching, as Eleanor's entire life was systematically dismantled. Jeffrey brought the manor's reeve, the official responsible for managing the lord's interests, to inventory William's possessions. Everything was counted, assessed, and divided. 1/3 to Eleanor as the widow's portion, the rest to Jeffrey as heir. But the division was not as simple or as fair as it might have sounded. The movable goods that Eleanor was entitled to 1/3 of did not include the land itself, of course. Nor did it include the cottage. That was considered part of the land tenancy and thus passed to Jeffrey. It did not include William's anvil or his forge equipment, which were considered part of the blacksmith shop and thus attached to the land. It did not include the stored grain from the harvest. Jeffrey argued successfully that this was meant to feed whoever worked the land next year, not to be divided as personal property. What Eleanor was left with was pitifully little. 1/3 of the household goods meant she got the cooking pot, but not the larger cauldron. She got one blanket, but not the better wool coverlet. She got a few wooden bowls and spoons, but not the good iron knife. Of the livestock, she was entitled to 1 chicken from their small flock of 6. Jeffrey graciously allowed her to take 2, since he said he did not need so many. The cow, of course, was too valuable to divide and went to Jeffrey entirely. Eleanor's portion of the movable goods, when everything was tallied, amounted to 1 iron cooking pot, 1 wool blanket, 2 wooden bowls, 3 wooden spoons, 1 small knife, 2 chickens, a spindle and distaff for spinning wool, and approximately 1/4 of the stored wool that Eleanor herself had spun over the summer. The total value of everything she owned in the world after 23 years of marriage and hard work was estimated at perhaps 8 pence, less than a skilled laborer might earn in 2 weeks of work. She had no coin at all. The few pennies that she and William had managed to save over the years were counted as part of the estate and divided accordingly. Eleanor's share came to just over 2 pence, barely enough to buy bread for a week. And she had nowhere to live. The 40-day grace period was ticking away, and at the end of it, Geoffrey would move his family into the cottage and Eleanor would be. Where? That was the question that haunted her as she lay awake at night on the straw mattress that would soon belong to someone else. She had considered her options carefully. She had no children to take her in, no siblings who were still living. Her father had died 6 years earlier, and her mother had died long before that, when Eleanor was just a girl. William had been the only surviving sibling after his brother's death, so there were no other family connections on his side except Geoffrey, and Geoffrey had made his position clear. She could perhaps find work as a servant in one of the wealthier households in the village or at the manor house itself. But such positions usually went to younger women, and at 41, Eleanor was considered old by medieval standards. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis from years of work in cold water. Her back ached constantly, and she tired more easily than she once had. She was not the ideal candidate for heavy domestic labor. She could try to support herself by spinning wool. Many widows and unmarried women survive this way, taking in raw wool and spinning it into thread for weavers, earning a few pennies here and there. But the payment for such work was minimal, barely enough to keep body and soul together, even for someone who had a place to live and a source of food. For someone who would need to pay for lodging and buy all her food, spinning alone would not be enough. She could appeal to the manor lord's wife for charity. The lady of the manor was expected to dispense alms to the deserving poor, and surely a respectable widow who had worked hard all her life qualified. But Eleanor's pride rebelled at the thought of begging, and she knew that charity was unreliable, generous one day, withdrawn the next, always dependent on the whims and moods of the wealthy. She could try to remarry. A widow could remarry without her family's permission, unlike a maiden who needed her father's consent. But Eleanor knew that finding a husband at 41 would be nearly impossible. Men who wanted to marry looked for young women who could bear children and work for decades. A middle-aged widow with no dowry, no land, and no prospects had little to offer a potential husband. And the thought of marrying some stranger simply for survival, of sharing a bed with a man she did not know or care for, filled Eleanor with a deep revulsion. Or she could simply try to survive on her own somehow, scraping together a living from whatever work she could find, whatever charity she could obtain, whatever resourcefulness she could muster. It would be desperately hard, perhaps impossible. But it would be her own life, her own choices, her own survival rather than dependence on the grudging mercy of others. As the days passed and the deadline approached, Eleanor found herself growing not just anxious but angry. The unfairness of her situation burned in her chest like a coal from William's forge. She had worked for 23 years building this life. She tended the garden that fed them, cared for the livestock, managed the household, helped William with his blacksmithing. She had nursed him through illnesses, mended his clothes, brewed the ale they drank, baked the bread they ate. She had buried their children and continued on. She had made this cottage a home and had made William's life comfortable and productive. And now, because of nothing more than the accident of her sex and the cruel logic of inheritance law. She was being cast out with almost nothing. She thought about other widows she had known over the years, and she realized how many of them had simply disappeared from village life after their husbands died. There had been Alice, married to the miller, who had been forced to leave when the miller's son inherited. Eleanor remembered her vaguely, a thin, nervous woman who had moved to her sister's household in another village and died within 2 years, worn out by her sister's grudging hospitality and the extra labor expected of her. There had been Joan, whose husband had held a small cottage and a few acres. When he died, his brother had inherited, and Joan had ended up as a live-in servant at the manor house, sleeping in the hall with the other servants, her entire life reduced to work and sleep with no space or time for anything else. There had been Margaret, who had tried to survive by spinning and doing odd jobs, living in a drafty shed that someone had let her occupy out of pity. She had lasted 3 winters before dying of a lung fever, coughing her life out in that cold shed with no one to tend her in her final hours. This was the fate that awaited women without male protection. Eleanor understood that now with a clarity that was almost painful. The law did not protect her. Customs did not protect her. The church spoke of charity and mercy, but its actual institutions offered little help to women in her situation. She was, quite simply, expendable, a burden that no one wanted to bear, a problem that everyone hoped would solve itself by her quietly disappearing or dying or somehow managing to survive without inconveniencing anyone. The 40th day after William's death arrived with a cold rain that turned the village paths to rivers of mud. Eleanor had packed her meager possessions into a rough sack she had sewn from scraps of cloth. The 2 chickens were in a small woven cage that she could carry. She had worn her warmest dress and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders like a cloak. She had eaten the last of the bread she had baked 3 days earlier, knowing she would need the strength for whatever came next. Geoffrey arrived at mid-morning with his wife and 3 children, and a cart loaded with their possessions. He had the decency to look uncomfortable when he saw Eleanor standing in the doorway, her packed belongings beside her. His wife, a sharp-faced woman named Matilda, looked merely impatient, eager to get inside and start arranging her new, larger home. "Eleanor," Geoffrey said, "I hope you have found somewhere to go." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "No, Geoffrey. I have nowhere to go, but do not let that trouble you. I will not burden you with my presence." She picked up her sack and the chicken cage and walked out into the rain. Behind her, she heard Matilda's voice, bright with excitement, already planning where to put their furniture, how to arrange the rooms. Eleanor did not look back. She walked down the muddy path toward the center of the village, her head high despite the rain soaking through her blanket and dress, despite the weight of her possessions dragging at her arms, despite the fact that she had no idea where she would sleep that night. She passed the church and considered going in to pray, but she was too angry at God to want to speak to him just now. She passed the manor house and considered going to beg for help, but her pride would not let her. She passed cottages where she had lived her entire life, houses of people she had known for decades, and no one opened a door to call her inside. Finally, she reached the small cottage where old Beatrice lived. Beatrice was ancient, perhaps 70 years old, a widow who had survived through a combination of her children's support and her own skill at herb lore. She grew medicinal plants in her garden and sold remedies to villagers who could not afford the physician's fees. Elinor had always liked Beatrice, had traded with her over the years. Elinor's fresh-baked bread for Beatrice's headache remedies, Elinor's help with heavy work for Beatrice's cough syrup. Elinor knocked on the door, and after a long moment, Beatrice opened it. The old woman looked at Elinor standing in the rain, took in the sack and the chickens and the desperation that must have been written on Elinor's face, and immediately stepped aside. "Come in, child," Beatrice said, and Elinor, 41 years old and feeling ancient herself, stepped gratefully into the small, warm cottage. Elinor set down her belongings and stood dripping on Beatrice's earthen floor, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of being allowed inside. The old woman shuffled to her small fire and stirred it to life, then handed Elinor a rag to dry her face. "Sit," Beatrice commanded, pointing to one of two stools near the hearth. "You look like death warmed over, and that's saying something given what I see most days." Elinor sat, her legs trembling now that she had stopped moving. The cottage was tiny, a single room that served as kitchen, workroom, and bedchamber all at once. Bundles of drying herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with the sharp, medicinal scent of sage and thyme, and other plants Elinor could not name. A narrow pallet occupied one corner, and shelves lined the walls, crowded with clay pots, small bottles, mortars and pestles, and various tools of the herbalist's trade. "Geoffrey threw you out," Beatrice said flatly. "It was not a question." "The law threw me out," Elinor replied, her voice bitter. "Geoffrey just enforced it." Beatrice made a disgusted sound deep in her throat. "The law. Men's law made by men for men. I've seen it happen 100 times in my life, girl. A woman works beside her husband for decades, bears his children, tends his house, helps him prosper. Then he dies and suddenly she owns nothing, has no rights, is worth less than the livestock in the barn. It's an evil system." Elinor felt tears prick at her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since William's funeral. "I don't know what to do, Beatrice. I have nowhere to go, no family, no prospects. Just these." She gestured at her pathetic pile of belongings. The old woman studied her for a long moment. "Can you still work? Your hands aren't so crippled you can't use them." "I can work," Elinor said, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. "I'm not young, but I'm not helpless." "Good. Then here's what I propose. You can stay here with me. Sleep on the floor by the fire, there's enough space. In exchange, you'll help me with the heavy work I can no longer manage. Digging in the garden, carrying water, gathering plants from the forest. I'll teach you what I know about herbs and healing, and you can help me prepare remedies. We'll pool our resources. Your chickens, my garden, your spinning, my herb selling. Between the two of us, we might just survive." Elinor felt something loosen in her chest, not quite hope, but a reprieve from the immediate terror of homelessness. "You would do this. You barely know me." Beatrice snorted. "I know you well enough. You're honest, you work hard, and you're not stupid. That's more than I can say for most. Besides, I'm old, Elinor. My children are scattered across 3 villages, too busy with their own families to help much. My son sends a bit of grain when he can spare it. My daughters visit once or twice a year. But day to day, I'm alone. Truth is, I could use the help as much as you need the shelter. We'll both benefit." "Thank you," Elinor whispered. "Truly thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Beatrice said dryly. "You haven't seen how hard I'll work for you. Now, get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. There's an old dress of mine in that chest. It'll be too short on you, but at least it's dry. Then we'll have some soup and figure out how to make this arrangement work." Over the following days and weeks, Elinor settled into her new life with Beatrice. It was a strange existence, so different from her years with William that sometimes she felt as if she had stepped into someone else's life entirely. The cottage was cramped with 2 people where there had been one, and Elinor's pallet on the floor was far less comfortable than the bed she had shared with William. The work was different too. Instead of managing a household and helping with blacksmithing, she was now learning the intricate art of herb craft and spending hours in the forest gathering plants. But there were unexpected pleasures as well. Beatrice was sharp-tongued and demanding, but she was also genuinely knowledgeable, and Elinor found herself fascinated by what the old woman taught her. She learned to identify dozens of plants by their leaves, their smell, their flowers. She learned which herbs could ease pain, which could bring down fever, which could help with women's monthly courses or ease the aches of old age. She learned to make poultices and tinctures, to dry herbs properly so they retain their potency, to mix remedies in the right proportions. Beatrice had spent more than 50 years accumulating this knowledge, learning from her own mother and grandmother, experimenting through trial and error, observing what worked and what didn't. In teaching Elinor, she was passing down a tradition that stretched back generations, the accumulated wisdom of countless women who had served as healers in their communities long before there were physicians or hospitals. The work was hard, though. Elinor's days began before dawn and ended long after dark. She hauled water from the well, tended the chickens, worked in Beatrice's extensive herb garden, gathered plants from the forest, prepared remedies under Beatrice's supervision, and spun wool in any spare moments. In the evenings, she helped Beatrice treat villagers who came seeking cures for various ailments. A mother with a colicky baby, a man with a festering wound, a woman suffering from headaches, a child with a persistent cough. The compensation for this work was minimal. Most people paid in kind: a few eggs, a small bag of grain, a cup of milk, a bit of cheese. Occasionally, someone would offer a penny or two, and Beatrice hoarded these coins carefully, knowing they might mean the difference between survival and starvation if the winter was especially harsh. Elena received no direct payment for her work. Her compensation was her shelter and a share of whatever food Beatrice managed to accumulate. It was a precarious existence, always teetering on the edge of hunger. The winter of 1316 was one of the worst in living memory, part of what would later be called the Great Famine that ravaged Europe for 7 years. The rains had started in the spring of 1315 and never seemed to stop. The grain rotted in the fields before it could be harvested. Livestock died from disease and malnutrition. Food prices soared to heights that put even basic sustenance beyond the reach of most peasants. People ate things they would never normally consider food: tree bark boiled into a thin gruel grass, roots dug from the forest, even clay mixed with water to fill their bellies even though it provided no nourishment. Elena and Beatrice survived that terrible winter, but only barely. They ate their chickens one by one as the months dragged on and food became scarcer. They made soup from nettles and wild garlic. They traded remedies for food, though people had less and less to trade as everyone's stores depleted. Beatrice's children sent what they could, but they were struggling too, their own families facing starvation. Elena lost weight, her already thin frame becoming skeletal, her cheekbones standing out sharply in her gaunt face. Her clothes hung loose on her body, and she was constantly, painfully cold. The hunger was worse than anything she had ever experienced, a gnawing, consuming sensation that filled every waking moment and invaded her dreams. She found herself thinking obsessively about food, remembering meals from years past in vivid detail, imagining the taste of fresh bread or roasted meat with an intensity that was almost painful. All around them, people were dying. The very young and very old went first, their bodies unable to withstand the prolonged deprivation. But as the winter dragged on, even the strong began to fall. Elena attended more funerals that winter than she could count. Neighbors, acquaintances, people she had known her entire life, all buried in the frozen ground while Father Thomas's voice droned out the prayers for the dead. Geoffrey's family fared better than most, protected by the extra resources of William's former holding. Elena sometimes saw Geoffrey or Matilda in the village, and they always looked away, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes. She wondered if they felt any guilt about her circumstances, but she doubted it. They had done what the law permitted, what custom sanctioned, what any practical person would do to secure their family's survival. That Elena had suffered for their gain was unfortunate, but it was not their responsibility. Through it all, Beatrice proved to be an unexpectedly fierce ally and teacher. The old woman refused to give up, refused to surrender to despair no matter how dire things became. She pushed Elena to keep working, to keep gathering plants even when her fingers were numb with cold, to keep preparing remedies even when they were both dizzy with hunger. And she continued to teach, passing on her knowledge with an urgency that suggested she knew her time was limited. Listen carefully, Beatrice would say as she showed Alina how to prepare a particular tincture. "Someday I'll be gone, and you'll need to know this. Someday you'll be the old woman teaching a younger one, and this knowledge must not be lost." Alina absorbed everything Beatrice taught her, grateful for both the distraction from hunger and the sense of purpose it gave her. She was learning a trade, developing skills that could support her even without a husband or male relative to provide for her. It was not the life she had imagined when she married William all those years ago, but it was a life nonetheless, and she was determined to survive it. Spring finally came, late and grudging, but when it arrived it brought the promise of food, wild plants emerging from the thawed ground, birds' eggs in nests, eventually new crops that could be planted and tended. Alina and Beatrice both survived to see that spring, though they were shadows of their former selves, their bodies weakened by months of near starvation. As the weather warmed and food became more available, Alina gradually regained some strength. She worked in Beatrice's garden, planting the herbs that would be needed for next winter's remedies. She gathered spring plants, dandelion greens, wild onions, sorrel, that could be eaten or traded. She took on more responsibility for treating patients, with Beatrice supervising less and less as the old woman's confidence in her student grew. By summer, Alina had been living with Beatrice for 8 months, and she had begun to think of this not as a temporary arrangement, but as her new life. She would never have what she'd had with William, a home of her own, a husband to share her days, the security of being part of a recognized household. But she would have purpose, skills, and work that mattered. She would have enough to survive, if barely. And she would have the bitter satisfaction of having endured despite everything the law and custom had done to cast her aside. It was in late July of 1316 that Beatrice's health suddenly declined. The old woman had been slowing down for months, but one morning she simply could not get out of bed. Her breathing was labored, her face gray, and when Alina felt her forehead, it was burning with fever. Alina nursed her as best she could, using all the remedies Beatrice had taught her. She brewed fever-reducing teas, made poultices for the old woman's chest, sat up through the nights keeping her comfortable. But she could see that Beatrice was dying, that whatever illness had taken hold was beyond her ability to cure. On the 3rd day of Beatrice's illness, the old woman rallied enough to speak clearly. She called Alina to her bedside and took her hand with surprising strength. "Listen to me, girl," Beatrice rasped. "I'm dying. We both know it. So there are things I need to tell you." "Don't talk like that," Alina protested, though she knew it was futile. "You'll recover. You're too stubborn to die." "Even I can't argue with death forever," Beatrice said with a weak smile. "Now hush and listen. This cottage, it's not much, but it's mine. I hold it by a special arrangement with the manor lord, made years ago when I nursed his mother through a difficult illness. When I die, the cottage doesn't automatically revert to the manor. The Lord has agreed that it can pass to whoever I designate as my heir in my trade." Alina felt her heart begin to pound. Beatrice, what are you saying? I'm saying that I've already spoken to the Reeve and to Father Thomas. I've told them that you are to inherit my cottage and my practice. You've learned enough to carry on the work, and the village needs a healer. They've agreed, Alina. When I die, this place is yours. You'll finally have security, a home that no one can take from you. Tears streamed down Alina's face. I don't deserve this. You've already given me so much. Nonsense. You've earned it through your work this past year. And besides, who else would I leave it to? My children are settled elsewhere, and none of them want to move back here to practice herb craft. No, you're the right choice, Alina. You'll do good work here. You'll help people. You'll survive. Beatrice died that night peacefully, with Alina holding her hand. Alina wept for her, wept for the loss of this fierce, generous woman who had saved her life, wept for the friendship that had grown between them despite the circumstances that had brought them together, wept with relief that she would not be cast out again, homeless and desperate. The funeral was simple, attended by most of the village. Beatrice had been respected, even beloved by many, and people came to pay their respects and to thank Alina for caring for the old woman in her final days. The Reeve confirmed publicly that Alina was to inherit Beatrice's cottage and practice, and Father Thomas blessed the arrangement, calling it a fitting tribute to Beatrice's generosity and Alina's dedication. And so, at 42 years old, nearly 2 years after William's death, Alina finally had a home again. It was not the home she had lost. This cottage was tiny compared to William's house, and the work was harder and less secure. But it was hers, genuinely hers in a way that nothing had been since she became a widow. No male relative could claim it. No inheritance law could take it away. She held it by her own skill and work, and as long as she continued to serve the village as a healer, it would remain hers. Alina threw herself into the work with renewed determination. She expanded Beatrice's garden, adding new herbs and experimenting with different remedies. She developed a reputation for skill and reliability, and gradually more patients came to her door. A woman with a difficult pregnancy, a child with a mysterious rash, an old man with painful joints, a young woman seeking herbs to prevent conception, a dangerous request, since the church forbade such things, but Alina provided them anyway, remembering her own desperate desire to control her own body after multiple miscarriages. She began to earn small amounts of coins in addition to payment in kind. She saved every penny carefully, building up a small reserve against future emergencies. She traded her services for help repairing her cottage, for firewood, for better blankets, for all the small necessities that made survival a little easier. She spun wool in the evenings and sold the thread, adding to her income. Slowly, incrementally, she built herself a life that, while still precarious, was more secure than it had been in the dark days after William's death. She also began to notice other widows in the village, women she had not paid much attention to before her own widowhood. There was Alice Wright, whose husband had died 3 years earlier. Alice had been more fortunate than Alina. Her husband had designated her as his heir in his will, and the manor lord had accepted this arrangement. She now held 5 acres of land in her own right and supported herself by farming it with hired help. She was one of the few widows Alina knew who had managed to maintain some independence and security. But there was also Joan Baker, who had not been so lucky. Joan's husband had held the village bakery, a lucrative business that had supported them comfortably. When he died, the bakery had passed to his brother, and Joan had been left with almost nothing. She now worked as a servant in the manor house, her entire existence reduced to labor for others, her skills and experience as a baker's wife utterly wasted. And there was Margaret Cooper, a woman in her 50s whose husband had died the previous winter. Margaret's situation was particularly tragic. Her husband had held 20 acres, and they had raised 4 children to adulthood. But all 4 children had daughters, no sons, and the inheritance had gone to the husband's nephew, a man who lived 2 villages away and had never even met Margaret. The nephew had claimed the land, sold off everything valuable, and told Margaret to fend for herself. She was currently living in a shed behind her daughter's cottage, reduced to begging and doing odd jobs for survival. Alina began to feel a burning anger on behalf of all these women. They had worked their entire lives, had contributed to their communities, had raised children and managed households and performed labor that was essential to their family's survival. And yet the law treated them as if they were worthless once their husbands died, as if their years of work counted for nothing, as if they had no right to the security they had helped create. She started speaking more openly about these injustices, talking with other women about their experiences, encouraging them to support each other, to share resources, to push back against the customs that oppressed them. It was dangerous talk. Women who complained too loudly about their lot in life could be accused of being shrews or scolds, could face public humiliation or worse. But Alina found she no longer cared about the danger. She had already lost everything once and survived. She was not going to stay silent while other women suffered. One evening in the autumn of 1317, Alina was sitting by her fire with several other village women, Alice Wright, and 2 younger women whose husbands were still living, but who had heard Alina's talk and been intrigued by it. They were discussing Margaret Cooper's situation, trying to figure out if there was any way to help the poor woman. "The law is the law," Alice said tiredly. "We can give Margaret charity. We can share our food with her, but we cannot change the fact that her husband's nephew inherited everything." "But why should it be that way?" demanded one of the younger women, a sharp-featured woman named Catherine. "Margaret worked that land for 30 years. She has more right to it than some nephew who never set foot on it until he came to claim his inheritance." "Because that's how inheritance works," Alice replied. "Land and property pass through male lines. It has always been this way." "That doesn't make it right," Alina said quietly. All eyes turned to her. "Just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it should continue. These laws were made by men, for men's benefit. They don't serve women, and they certainly don't serve justice. Careful, Eleanor, Alice warned. That kind of talk can bring trouble. What more trouble can I have? Eleanor shot back. I've already been made homeless, have already been cast out to starve. I've survived, but only barely, and only because Beatrice was generous enough to help me. How many other women haven't been so lucky? How many have died because the law stripped them of everything they had worked for? Catherine leaned forward, her eyes bright. What are you suggesting, Eleanor? That we try to change the law? That's impossible. The manor lords would never agree to it. I'm not sure what I'm suggesting, Eleanor admitted. But I think we need to start talking about these things openly. We need to document what happens to widows, to show how cruel and unjust these customs are. And we need to support each other, to make sure that no widow in this village is left completely destitute if we can prevent it. They talked late into the night, these four women, discussing possibilities and sharing stories. They decided to form a kind of informal support network. They would check on widows regularly, would pool resources to help those in need, and would speak up for fair treatment when they could. It was not much, but it was something, a small act of resistance against a system that seemed designed to grind women down. Word of these meetings spread, and gradually more women began attending. Some were widows themselves, grateful for the support and solidarity. Others were wives who wanted to be prepared in case they too found themselves widowed someday. Still others were simply women who recognized the injustice of the current system and wanted to be part of changing it, however incrementally. The men of the village watched these gatherings with varying degrees of suspicion and hostility. Some dismissed them as harmless female gossip. Others worried that the women were plotting something dangerous. Geoffrey, Eleanor's husband's nephew who had inherited William's land, was particularly vocal in his disapproval. Eleanor is stirring up trouble, he complained to the Reeve one day. She's making the women discontent, filling their heads with ideas about rights and fairness. It's not natural. A woman's place is to accept what Providence provides, not to question the ancient customs. The Reeve, a practical man named Thomas who had known Eleanor for years, was less concerned. What exactly is Eleanor doing that breaks any law? She tends the sick, she meets with friends, she talks. None of that is forbidden. She's undermining the proper order of things, Geoffrey insisted. If widows start demanding rights to their husband's land, if they start refusing to accept the normal inheritance customs, the whole system will fall apart. What if my own wife gets ideas? What if she decides she should inherit from me instead of my property going to my son? Thomas studied Geoffrey for a long moment. Your fear is showing, Geoffrey. And I wonder, if the current system is so just and proper, why are you afraid of people questioning it? Geoffrey had no answer to that, and he left the meeting frustrated and angry. But he was not the only man who felt threatened by Eleanor's growing influence among the village women. There were mutterings about her in the alehouses, speculation about whether she was overstepping her proper place, or whether she might be dangerous in some vague, undefined way. Eleanor was aware of the hostility, but she continued her work undeterred. She had learned that she could survive far more than she had ever thought possible, and the disapproval of men like Geoffrey seemed almost trivial compared to the genuine suffering she saw among the village's widows. She would not be silenced, would not stop advocating for fairness and justice, regardless of the personal cost. In the spring of 1318, 3 years after William's death, Eleanor's network of women faced its first real test. A widow named Edith, whose husband had died just weeks earlier, came to Eleanor's cottage in tears. Edith was 35 years old with 2 young daughters, and her situation was desperate in a way that made even Eleanor's experience seem almost fortunate by comparison. Edith's husband, Robert, had been a cotter, one of the poorest class of peasants, holding only a small cottage and perhaps 2 acres of land. He had supplemented their meager income by working as a day laborer for wealthier villagers. When he died suddenly of a flux, Edith had expected to at least keep the cottage and the tiny plot of land. But Robert's lord, a different manner lord than the one Eleanor's family served, had refused to allow it. He says the cottage reverts to him, Edith sobbed, sitting on Eleanor's stool while her daughters huddled against her skirts. He says I can stay only if I pay an entry fine to take up the tenancy in my own right. But the fine is 3 shillings, Eleanor, 3 shillings. I don't have 3 pence, let alone 3 shillings. Where would I possibly get such a sum? Eleanor felt her anger kindle again, hot and fierce. 3 shillings was an enormous amount of money for a peasant, more than most cotters could earn in months of work. It was clearly an impossible demand, designed to force Edith out, so the lord could grant the tenancy to someone who could pay. "Have you spoken to the reeve?" Eleanor asked. "Have you appealed to the Lord's steward?" "Yes, both of them. They just repeated what the Lord said, 3 shillings or leave. I have 2 weeks, Eleanor. 2 weeks to find 3 shillings, or we'll be homeless. I have 2 daughters, no money, no family who can help. What am I going to do?" Eleanor thought quickly. 3 shillings was an impossible sum for any one person in their position to provide, but if multiple people contributed. "Wait here," she told Edith. "I'm going to call a meeting." Within hours, Eleanor had gathered her network of women at Alice Wright's cottage. Alice's position as a landholder gave her a certain status that made her home a safer meeting place than Eleanor's. There were a dozen women present, ranging from elderly widows to young wives, from relatively prosperous to desperately poor. Eleanor explained Edith's situation, and the room erupted in angry exclamations. Several women had similar stories. Entry fines demanded after husbands' deaths, fines that were clearly designed to be unpayable, that served as a way to dispossess widows of even the smallest holdings. "We can't pay 3 shillings, one woman said flatly. "Between all of us, we might scrape together 1 shilling perhaps, but 3. It's impossible." "Then we need to try something else," Eleanor said. We need to appeal directly to the manor lord to make him see how unjust this is. He won't care, Alice said wearily. Lords don't care about the suffering of poor widows. They care about rent and profits and maintaining their rights over their tenants. Maybe not, Eleanor conceded. But we have to try. And if he won't listen to reason, perhaps he'll listen to pressure. What if we all went together to petition him? 12 women publicly demanding justice. It would be hard for him to simply dismiss us all. There was nervous murmuring at this suggestion. Directly confronting a manor lord was dangerous, potentially very dangerous. Lords had enormous power over their tenants, and openly challenging them could result in fines, imprisonment, or worse. But Catherine, the sharp-faced younger woman, spoke up boldly. I'll go. This could happen to any of us. Today it's Edith. Tomorrow it could be me or you or anyone. We need to stand together. One by one, the other women agreed. They would go as a group to petition the Lord for mercy on Edith's behalf, to argue that the entry fine should be waived, or at least reduced to something she could actually pay. It was frightening, but it felt like the right thing to do. 3 days later, a delegation of 12 women walked to the manor house. Eleanor had coached them carefully on what to say, how to present their case without seeming too challenging or rebellious. They would appeal to the Lord's sense of charity and Christian duty, would emphasize Edith's respectability and her husband's years of loyal service, would frame their request as seeking mercy rather than demanding rights. The Lord, Sir William of Brackley, was a man in his 50s who had inherited the manor from his father and spent most of his time managing his various properties across 3 counties. He received the women in his hall with obvious irritation, clearly viewing this as an interruption to more important business. Eleanor stepped forward as the group's spokesperson. She had dressed in her most respectable clothes, had made sure her head was properly covered, had adopted the most deferential posture she could manage while still maintaining her dignity. "My lord," she began, keeping her eyes lowered, "we come to beg your mercy on behalf of Edith, widow of Robert the Cotter. Her husband served your manor faithfully for 15 years, and his death has left her and her 2 young daughters in desperate straits. The entry fine demanded for her to maintain the cottage is beyond her ability to pay. We humbly ask that you consider reducing it to an amount she might manage, or perhaps allowing her to pay in service rather than coin." Sir William looked at them with an expression somewhere between boredom and contempt. "The entry fine is set according to the value of the holding and the custom of the manor. I do not reduce fines simply because a tenant cannot pay them. If this woman cannot afford to take up her husband's tenancy, she should find other arrangements." "But my lord," Eleanor persisted, "she has nowhere to go, no family to help her. Her daughters are only 8 and 10 years old. If you force them out, they will likely starve or die of exposure. Surely Christian charity." "Do not presume to lecture me about Christian charity," Sir William interrupted, his voice sharp. "I give alms to the deserving poor through the church, as is proper. But I will not compromise the proper administration of my manor out of sentiment. The fine stands." Alice Wright stepped forward, her status as a landholder perhaps giving her slightly more standing. "My lord, what if the women of the village contributed to help Edith pay the fine? If we could raise, say, 1 shilling between us, would you accept that as sufficient?" Sir William considered this for a moment. 1 shilling is still far less than the customary fine. But he paused, calculating. "If you can raise 2 shillings by the end of the week, I will accept that as payment. Not a penny less, and this is a one-time concession, not a precedent. Do you understand?" It was still an enormous sum, but it was at least theoretically possible. Elinor nodded quickly. "Yes, my lord." "Thank you, my lord. We will find the 2 shillings." They left the manor house both relieved and daunted. 2 shillings was still more money than most of them had ever held at once, but at least it was a goal they could work toward rather than an impossible barrier. Over the next 4 days, Elinor and the other women threw themselves into a frantic effort to raise the money. They went door to door throughout the village, appealing to anyone who might help. They emphasized that this was about helping 2 orphaned children. They played on people's fears of their own potential widowhood. They begged and cajoled, and in some cases shamed people into contributing. Elinor herself contributed the 3 pence she had been saving, nearly all her reserve. Alice Wright gave 6 pence, a huge sum that left her nearly depleted. Catherine pawned her good wool cloak for 4 pence. Other women contributed a penny here, a halfpenny there. They organized a special sale of remedies and Elinor's spun thread, with all proceeds going to the fund. They appealed to Father Thomas, who contributed 2 pence from the church poor box after Elinor convinced him that helping a widow and orphans was exactly what such funds were meant for. By the end of the week, they had raised 1 shilling and 10 pence, still 2 pence short. Elinor stared at the small pile of coins on her table with desperation. They were so close, but 2 pence might as well have been 2 shillings for all their ability to find it. Then young Catherine appeared at Elinor's door with a determined expression. "I have the last 2 pence, she said. "I've been saving them to buy clothes for a new dress, but this is more important. Take them." Elinor felt tears sting her eyes. "Catherine, you can't give up your savings. You've worked so hard." "I can earn more," Catherine said firmly. "Edith and her daughters can't wait. Take the money, Elinor. Let's finish this." They delivered the 2 shillings to the manor steward the next morning, with Edith sobbing in gratitude. The steward counted the coins carefully, made a mark in his records, and grudgingly handed over a token that confirmed Edith's right to remain in her cottage. The victory felt enormous, and yet bitterly inadequate. They had saved 1 widow and her children, but at tremendous cost, and only by begging for what should have been Edith's right to begin with. The system itself remained unchanged, still grinding down vulnerable women, still placing property rights and male inheritance above human suffering. But word of what the women had done spread quickly through the village and beyond. People talked about how Eleanor and her network had organized, had confronted the manor lord, and had raised an impossible sum through collective effort. Some praised them for their charity and determination. Others criticized them for overstepping their place, for organizing themselves without male supervision, for challenging established customs. The controversy came to a head in the summer of 1318, when Father Thomas summoned Eleanor to the church. The old priest looked troubled as he gestured for her to sit on one of the stone benches near the altar. "Eleanor," he began carefully, "I need to speak with you about these meetings you've been organizing. There are concerns being raised." "What kind of concerns, Father?" Eleanor asked, though she could guess. "Some of the men in the village, and not just the men, some women too, feel that you are stirring up discontent, that you are encouraging women to question their proper place, to challenge lawful authority. There is talk that your gatherings are becoming inappropriate." Eleanor felt her temper flare. "Inappropriate. We are helping widows, Father. We are providing charity and support to those in need. Isn't that exactly what Christ commanded us to do?" "Of course, charity is virtuous," Father Thomas said. "But there are proper channels for such things. The church distributes alms. The manor lord has obligations to his tenants. When you organize outside these established structures, when you encourage women to band together and pressure their betters, it creates disorder. The established structures have failed us," Eleanor said bluntly. "The church's alms are insufficient and inconsistently distributed. The manor lords care more about their rights than their tenants' survival. We are doing what must be done because no one else will do it." Father Thomas sighed heavily. "I understand your frustration, Eleanor. Truly I do. I've watched good women suffer through circumstances beyond their control. But you must understand that there are limits to what I can protect you from. If you continue on this path, if you continue to organize and agitate, there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Eleanor asked, though her stomach was already clenching with fear. "At best, social censure, loss of patience, difficulty earning your living. At worst," he paused significantly, "there are those who whisper that your knowledge of herbs is unnatural, that your influence over other women suggests you might be practicing witchcraft. I know these accusations are false, but once such talk starts, it can be very difficult to stop." The threat was clear, and Eleanor felt ice run down her spine. Accusations of witchcraft could destroy her completely, could lead to imprisonment, torture, execution. And such accusations were most often leveled against women who stepped outside their prescribed roles, who demonstrated knowledge or power that threatened male authority. "So I should stay quiet," Eleanor said bitterly. "I should watch other women suffer and do nothing because speaking up might endanger me." "I'm not saying you should do nothing," Father Thomas replied gently. "I'm saying you should be careful. Help people quietly, individually. Don't organize. Don't create structures that look like challenges to authority. Work within the system rather than against it. Alina left the church feeling defeated and angry in equal measure. She understood that Father Thomas was trying to protect her, that his warning came from concern rather than malice. But the idea of backing down, of retreating to individual charity while the unjust system continued unchanged, felt like betrayal of everything she had been fighting for. She called a meeting of her network that evening and explained what Father Thomas had said. The women's reactions varied from fear to defiance. "We should stop," one older widow said nervously. "I can't risk being accused of witchcraft. I've seen what happens to women who fall under such suspicion." "If we stop, nothing will ever change," Catherine argued. "We'll continue to be at the mercy of laws that don't care whether we live or die." "Maybe change has to happen slowly," Alice suggested. "Maybe instead of direct confrontation, we work more subtly. We help each other quietly. We document what happens to widows so that someday someone might use that information to argue for reform. But we don't create such visible opposition that we become targets." They debated for hours and eventually reached a compromise. They would continue their support network, but they would be more discreet about it. No more public confrontations with manor lords. No more large gatherings that could be seen as threatening. Instead, they would work in smaller groups, would help each other quietly, would maintain their solidarity, but in ways that were less visible to those who might want to suppress them. It felt like a retreat, and Alina hated it, but she also recognized the wisdom of survival. She could do more good living and working carefully than she could be dead or imprisoned. Sometimes prudence was not cowardice but strategy. Over the following years, Alina continued her work as a healer and continued her quiet advocacy for widows. She treated patients, taught younger women about herb lore, and gradually built up a modest security. She never remarried. The thought of surrendering her hard-won independence to another husband held no appeal, and she never had the children she had once longed for. But she created a different kind of legacy. She began keeping records, written down with the help of a young monk from the monastery who was sympathetic to her cause. She documented every case of widow dispossession she knew of, recording names, dates, circumstances. She noted the entry fines demanded, the property seized, the women left homeless. She recorded which manor lords were harsher and which were more merciful, which customs were most cruel, and which offered some protection to vulnerable women. It was slow, painstaking work, and Alina had no illusion that it would lead to immediate change. But she believed, had to believe, that someday, somehow, this record might matter, that future generations might look at this documentation and see the injustice clearly, might be moved to create better laws, fairer systems. She also began training several younger women in herb craft, deliberately building a succession of healers who could continue the work after she was gone. She taught them not just the technical knowledge of remedies and treatments, but also the importance of supporting other women, of using whatever limited power they had to help those more vulnerable than themselves. Among her students was young Emma, not little Emma Alcock who Eleanor had helped bring into the world years ago, but Emma Fletcher, a bright girl of 16 whose mother had recently died of a wasting illness. Emma was eager to learn, quick-witted, and possessed of a fierce sense of justice that reminded Eleanor of her younger self. Eleanor saw in Emma the possibility of carrying forward the work, of maintaining the network of support that had meant the difference between life and death for so many widows. By 1325, Eleanor was 52 years old, ancient by medieval standards, but still relatively healthy despite the hardships she had endured. Her cottage was secure, her reputation as a healer was solid, and her network of women, though operating more quietly than it once had, continued to function effectively. She had helped dozens of widows survive circumstances that might otherwise have killed them, had documented countless injustices, had trained a new generation of healers and advocates. It was not the life she had imagined when she was young Eleanor Carpenter, marrying William the blacksmith with hopes of children and domestic security. But it was a life that mattered, a life that had made a genuine difference in her community. She had transformed her own suffering into purpose and had used her experience of injustice to fight for others facing similar circumstances. One autumn evening, as Eleanor sat by her fire with Emma Fletcher working on a remedy across from her, the younger woman asked a question that made Eleanor pause in her work. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked. "Not remarrying, I mean. Living alone all these years, working so hard, never having the security of a husband." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I regret that the world is structured in a way that makes a husband necessary for a woman's security," she said slowly. "I regret that I lost William, who was a good man and a good partner. I regret that the law took from me what I had helped build and forced me to start over with nothing." She paused, stirring the mixture in her mortar. "But do I regret choosing independence over remarriage? No. I've lived on my own terms these past 10 years, made my own choices, built something that belongs to me and cannot be taken away by any male relative or inheritance law. That freedom has been worth the hardship." "Not all women have that choice," Emma observed. "No," Eleanor agreed. "Most don't. I've been lucky in some ways. Lucky that Beatrice took me in. Lucky that I had skills I could develop. Lucky that this village needed a healer. Many widows aren't so fortunate. That's why the work we do matters, Emma. We help women survive when the system fails them. We create the support structures that the law and the church and the manor lords don't provide." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "And someday, maybe, the system itself will change." "Maybe," Eleanor said. "Probably not in my lifetime, perhaps not even in yours. But change has to start somewhere. Every widow we help survive is a small victory against the unjust system. Every woman we teach to advocate for herself and others is a seed planted for future change. We may not see the harvest, but we can plant the seeds." As winter approached in 1325, Eleanor received word that Sir William of Brackley, The manor lord who had demanded the impossible entry fine from Edith years earlier had died. His son, a man named Richard who was said to be more moderate in temperament, would be inheriting the manor. Elinor wondered if this change might bring any improvement in conditions for the manor's tenants, particularly its widows, but she had learned not to hope for too much from the nobility. What she did not expect was to be summoned to meet with the new lord just weeks after his arrival. The summons came through the reeve, delivered with an apologetic expression that suggested even the reeve was uncertain what this was about. Elinor went to the manor house with considerable trepidation, remembering her last encounter with Sir William, and fearing that his son might be even worse. She was shown into a small chamber where Richard of Brackley sat reviewing documents with his steward. He was younger than Elinor had expected, perhaps 35, with a serious face and careful manner. "Elinor the healer," Richard said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming. I've been reviewing my late father's records, and your name appears several times in connection with disputes over widows' rights and entry fines." Elinor's heart sank. This was it then. She was going to be punished for her advocacy, perhaps forbidden from practicing her healing trade, perhaps even accused of fomenting rebellion against the Lord's authority. But Richard surprised her. "I've also been speaking with Father Thomas and with some of the village women," he continued. "They tell me you've been documenting cases of widow dispossession, keeping records of what happens to women after their husbands die. Is this true?" Elinor saw no point in denying it. "Yes, my lord. I keep such records. May I see them?" Elinor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "They're at my cottage. I could bring them to you if you wish." "Please do. And Elinor, I'm not asking so that I can punish you. I'm asking because I think you may have information that could be useful. My father ran this manor according to old customs that he never questioned, but I'm not convinced they're the most effective or the most just. I'd like to understand better what actually happens to widows under current practices." It took Elinor a moment to process this unexpected response. "You want to improve conditions for widows." "I want to run a prosperous, stable manor," Richard said pragmatically. "And I've observed that when widows are left destitute, it creates problems. They become dependent on parish charity, which strains church resources. Or they die, which means lost labor and orphaned children who also become burdens. Or they turn to begging or theft, which creates social disorder. It seems to me that there might be more effective approaches." Elinor felt a cautious hope stirring. "My lord, if you're genuinely interested, I have 10 years of records. I can show you exactly what happens under different circumstances, which customs leave widows able to support themselves, and which leave them destitute. I can show you the hidden costs of the current system." "That is exactly what I want to see," Richard said. "Bring me your records tomorrow. And Elinor, I make no promises about what I can change, Manor customs are not easily altered, and I must balance many interests. But I am at least willing to listen and to consider whether reforms might be beneficial. Alina left the manor house in a daze. She had expected punishment and received instead an invitation to share her knowledge. She barely dared to hope that anything would come of it, but even the fact that a manor lord was willing to listen felt like progress. She spent that evening organizing her records with Emma's help, selecting the most compelling cases to present. There was Edith, forced to scrape together an impossible entry fine. There was Margaret Cooper, dispossessed despite 30 years of work on her husband's land. There were dozens of other cases, each documenting the human cost of customs that privileged male inheritance above all else. The next day, Alina presented her records to Richard and his steward. They spent hours reviewing the documents, asking questions, and discussing the implications. Richard was particularly struck by Alina's calculations of the broader costs. The parish funds spent on begging widows who might have supported themselves if they'd retained some property, the orphaned children who became communal burdens, the loss of experienced workers who were forced out of their homes. "You make a compelling economic argument," Richard said finally, "though I notice you've also included moral arguments about justice and fairness." "Yes, my lord," Alina said, "because there is a moral dimension to these decisions. These are not just economic calculations, but human lives. Women who worked hard all their lives, who contributed to their families and communities, who deserve better than to be cast out with nothing when their husbands die." Richard was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "You speak from experience, don't you? This happened to you?" "Yes, my lord. My husband died 10 years ago, and his nephew inherited everything. I was left with a cooking pot, a blanket, and 2 chickens. I survived only because another widow took me in and taught me her trade. Many women are not so fortunate. And yet here you are," Richard observed. "You've not only survived but built something, a healing practice, a support network, this remarkable record of injustice. That suggests considerable strength and capability." "Many women have such capability, my lord," Alina said quietly. "We simply don't often get the chance to demonstrate it." Over the following months, Richard worked with his steward and legal advisors to develop reforms to the manor's customs regarding widows. It was slow, careful work, requiring consultation with other landholders and negotiation with the church. Alina was occasionally called to provide input, though always carefully and quietly. Richard was astute enough to understand that appearing to take advice from a peasant woman would undermine his authority with other nobles. The reforms that eventually emerged were not everything Alina had hoped for, but they were significant nonetheless. Widows would now be permitted to inherit their husbands' holdings for their lifetime, provided they could pay a reduced entry fine, 1/4 of the customary amount rather than the full sum. If a widow could not afford even the reduced fine, she could pay through labor services instead, working off the debt over time. Widows with young children would receive additional considerations, including the right to remain in their cottages until the children reached working age. The new customs were formally proclaimed in the spring of 1326, and their impact was immediate. Within months, 3 widows who would previously have been dispossessed were able to maintain their homes and livelihoods. The reduced entry fines were still a burden, but they were at least achievable for most women with some community support. Elinor watched these changes with a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Satisfaction because lives were being improved, because the system was becoming marginally less cruel. Frustration because the reforms were still so limited, because women were still treated as lesser beings whose rights existed only at male sufferance, because even this modest progress had required years of work and the unlikely intervention of an unusually reasonable manor lord. But she recognized that change happened slowly, incrementally, through small victories that accumulated over time. She had helped document the injustices, had kept the pressure on through her advocacy, and had been ready when an opportunity arose to present her case. And now, at least on this one manor, widows had marginally better protection than they had before. Word of Richard of Brackley's reforms spread to neighboring manors, and some other lords began to consider similar measures. A few adopted variations of Richard's policies. Others dismissed them as soft-headed sentimentality. But the conversation had begun. The possibility of reform had been demonstrated, and that mattered. Elinor continued her work as a healer and continued training younger women to carry on after her. Emma Fletcher proved to be an excellent student, mastering not just the technical knowledge, but also the deeper wisdom. How to negotiate with difficult patients, how to maintain dignity while serving others, how to use the limited power available to help those even more vulnerable. In 1328, when Elinor was 55 years old, Emma came to her with news. She had been offered a position as healer in a village 2 days' journey away. A larger community with more potential patients and better resources. It was an excellent opportunity, one that Elinor had no right to stand in the way of. "I want you to take it," Elinor told Emma firmly, ignoring the ache in her chest at the thought of losing her apprentice and companion. "You're ready. More than ready. You'll do excellent work there." "But what about you?" Emma asked. "Who will help you? Who will carry on your work here?" "I'll train someone else," Elinor said. "There's always another young woman who needs to learn, who can benefit from this knowledge. And Emma, when you go to your new village, I want you to do something for me. I want you to start keeping records just as I have. Document what happens to the widows there, what customs govern inheritance, how women fare. Someday, all these records together might help build a case for broader reforms." Emma nodded, her eyes bright with tears. "I will. I promise, and Elinor, thank you for everything you've taught me. Not just about herbs and healing, but about justice and resistance, and refusing to accept cruelty as inevitable." After Emma left, Elinor felt the weight of her years more heavily. She was slowing down, her joints stiff with arthritis, her eyesight not as sharp as it had been, her energy depleted more quickly. She knew that her time was growing shorter, that the hard years of hunger and cold and relentless work had taken their toll on her body. She took on a new apprentice, a quiet girl named Alice who showed promise, and began the slow work of passing on her knowledge once again. But increasingly, Alina found herself thinking about legacy, about what would remain after she was gone. She had helped individual women, yes. She had documented injustices, had pushed for reforms, and had trained healers who would continue the work. But the fundamental structures of oppression remained intact. Women were still legally subordinate to men, still unable to own property in their own right, still vulnerable to dispossession and poverty whenever they lost male protection. The reforms on Richard of Brackley's manor were real but limited, and they could be reversed by the next lord if he chose. Still, Alina reminded herself, she had done what she could. She had taken her own suffering and transformed it into purpose. She had refused to accept injustice as inevitable and had fought back in whatever ways were available to her. She had planted seeds that might, someday, somehow, grow into real change. In the winter of 1330, Alina fell seriously ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, then developed into a fever that left her weak and breathless. Young Alice tended her carefully, using all the remedies Alina had taught her, but they both knew this was an illness that herbs could not cure. Alina's body, worn out by 57 years of hard living, was simply giving out. As she lay in her bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, Alina found herself thinking about William. It had been 15 years since his death, and the pain of losing him had long since faded to a distant ache. But she found herself wondering what he would think of what she had become, of the life she had built after being cast out of their shared home. Would he be proud of her advocacy and her refusal to accept defeat? Or would he be troubled by how she had pushed against the established order, challenged customs that he had simply accepted as the way things were? She liked to think he would be proud. William had been a good man, and good men, even men of their time and place, could recognize injustice when it was pointed out to them. She hoped that if their situations had been reversed, if she had died first and he had been the one left vulnerable, she would have wanted him to fight for his survival just as fiercely as she had fought for hers. Alina died on a cold January morning, with Alice holding her hand and several women from her network gathered around. They buried her in the churchyard, and Father Thomas, now ancient himself, but still the village priest, spoke of her skill as a healer and her generosity in helping those in need. He was careful not to mention her advocacy work, not to draw attention to the ways she had pushed against authority, but the women who attended her funeral knew. They remembered what she had done, what she had fought for, what she had tried to change. Among Alina's possessions, found after her death, were her careful records, 10 years of documentation showing what happened to widows under different inheritance customs. Alice kept these records and added to them, and when she eventually passed them to her own apprentice, They became part of a growing archive of women's experiences that would, centuries later, be discovered by scholars studying medieval social conditions. Also found among Eleanor's things was a letter, carefully written by the young monk who had helped her with record-keeping years earlier. It was addressed to whoever finds this, and explained Eleanor's work, her advocacy, her determination to document injustices in hopes that future generations might learn from them and build a more just society. Eleanor of Ashford, the letter read, was thrown into poverty through no fault of her own, victimized by laws that treated women as property rather than persons. She survived through determination, skill, and the kindness of another woman who saw her value. And rather than simply accepting her fate, she fought, quietly but persistently, for better treatment of women in her position. She saved lives, documented injustices, and planted seeds of reform that I pray will someday bear fruit. May those who read this remember her courage and carry forward her work. And so we leave Eleanor here, at the end of a life that was shaped by loss but defined by resilience. She lived in a world that was brutally unfair to women, particularly widows, where the law itself could strip away everything a woman had worked for the moment her husband died. She experienced that injustice firsthand and nearly perished because of it, but Eleanor survived. More than that, she transformed her own suffering into a tool for helping others, for documenting injustice, for pushing, however carefully and incrementally, toward change. She could not overthrow the system that oppressed her, but she could make it marginally more bearable for the women who came after her. She could keep records so that injustice would not be forgotten. She could train younger women to continue the work. She could plant seeds that might, generations later, grow into real reform. Medieval inheritance laws were cruel, stripping widows of security and casting them into poverty and vulnerability. Countless women suffered under these laws, and many died as a result. But there were also women like Eleanor, women who refused to simply accept their fate, who fought back in whatever ways were available to them, who supported each other and advocated for justice even when the odds seemed impossible. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest times, even under the most oppressive systems, human beings have the capacity to resist, to organize, to demand better. Change is always slow and always hard one, but it is possible. And it begins with people like Eleanor, ordinary individuals who decide that injustice is not acceptable, who document wrongs, who speak up, who refuse to give in to despair. Sleep now, dear listener, and remember that the struggle for justice is long and spans generations. The work that Eleanor began in her small medieval village echoes forward through time, part of the endless human effort to build a more fair and compassionate world. May her courage inspire us, and may her memory remind us that every act of resistance, however small, matters. Every person who fights for justice contributes to change, even if they never see the full results of their work. Rest well, knowing that human dignity and determination endure through centuries of hardship, and that the fight for fairness continues in each generation, carried forward by those who refuse to accept cruelty as inevitable. Good night.